Chapter 14. Through the use of Jennifer's key, they were able to quickly travel the rest of the distance to their ship. Jennifer was again rendered unconscious because of the extensive use of her key, but she had been glad to help Victor get to the comfort of their boat. Of course, the comfort of their boat was only relative to the comfort of walking through the frozen wastes of Antarctica. The boat was not particularly large. Bits of fish had been ground into the floors over years of fishing, and it took some time before everyone adjusted to the odor. The engine provided heat in the cabin. They had laid blankets across the floor on which they could lie down. This was especially useful for Jennifer, who was still sleeping a lot to recover, and Kirana, who was trying to avoid becoming seasick. There were a pair of flickering lamps that provided dim lighting as they traveled in the perpetual night. It also made it more difficult to tell where the yellow stains on the wall started and the shadows of people started. There was a large door on the side at the front with a bent metal knob that led to the deck outside. There was a small port window on it that was stained with tar to the point that it was opaque. Rust seemed to surround several of the bolts and hinges in various cupboards on the wall. The wheel and a few gauges were gathered in a cluster of the front of the cabin. Row 82 quickly manned the controls as they boarded and steered them north. The deck outside the cabin had a wooden surface that was well coated with resin. There was a rail around the bow, port, and starboard sides, allowing room for people to get some air or help in the docking process. The journey north seemed solemn. They were still without a clear direction, other than knowing they needed to go to the temperate zone in order to survive. The weather was surprisingly calm, and it was the sound of the engine of their boat that filled their ears more than the wind and waves of the sea. The cabin was cramped for 9 people, and Lizard frequently made excursions to get supplies. It was plain to see these excursions were taking a toll on him. No one dared to ask him the details of his travels, but as he brought back supplies that were coated in ice or that were hot to the touch, they realized he was seeing firsthand the results of the world adjusting to its new orbit. Victor imagined the horrors of seeing people frozen together in the south or completely dehydrated in the north. While none of them were strangers to death, none of them had seen anything on the scale of the disaster occurring throughout the world. Victor looked down at his key and longed for the ability to use it on behalf of those that were suffering. His thoughts took him back to his home. His parents had sacrificed everything to preserve his life, and to preserve faith in the divine keys. He thought it seemed ironic that bearers of divine keys had been the ones to cause the horrors that had plunged the world into chaos, and wondered if his parents would have been so eager to pass on their beliefs if they had known the events that came after that. His attention turned to Jennifer. She slept peacefully as the ship bobbed up and down on the waves. Her long blonde hair covered her shoulders. He smiled softly as he watched her and pulled a lock of hair behind her ear in the same way she did when she was nervous about something. He suddenly felt a bit awkward doing so in front of the others and turned to see if anyone else was watching. Lizard was giving him a look that made him wonder whether Lizard was confused or disgusted. "And I'm out of here," said Lizard as he teleported away. Victor turned a little red, and then noticed that Row 82 was giving him an equally awkward look. "I envy Lizard's ability to leave," said Row 82. "You and Jonathan are barely tolerable." He turned to face Jonathan. He was cuddling with Kirana. If she was awake, she did not give any reaction to the augment's comments. Jonathan, however, turned bright red. Stephanie frowned and got up. She opened the door on the cabin, and a cold, salty wind rushed in. Row 82 backed up and covered the metal plates behind his ears to avoid the pain associated with quick temperature changes. She pulled the door shut and walked out on the small deck where Sig stood and walked next to him. Sig turned and noticed Stephanie approaching. He gave her a wide smile, and she could not help but return it. After swearing to Erica Kingsley that she would let go of her bitterness, she decided that it was good to spend time around the person who seemed impossible to discourage. "Stephanie," he shouted over the wind, "come to enjoy the sea breeze?" Of course, the wind was a bit stronger than just a breeze, but it was refreshing to feel the air rushing through her hair after being cramped in the stuffy cabin for so long. She had never imagined that she would be on a boat in the great sea during her days crawling through tunnels in the augment farm. Stephanie finally nodded in response. Sig laughed loudly. "This sea air is fantastic," shouted Sig. "I haven't been on the sea since I was very young." Stephanie raised her eyebrows. She was curious about how Sig had come to be the large optimist that bound their group together. "You know," he continued, "if it weren't so dark here, we could probably see lots of fish." Stephanie gave a look of confusion, as though to ask, "What is a fish?" "That's right," said Sig. "You probably didn't have any fish in Kappa 16's fortress. They are scaled animals that live in the seas. They breathe water instead of air." The idea of breathing water sounded preposterous to Stephanie. Her expression must have revealed her skepticism to Sig as he laughed loudly. "I never thought of how that might seem to someone who had never been to the sea," said Sig. "But they are real creatures. There are some smaller than your little finger, and others that are larger than I am. They were excellent for meat." Stephanie shrugged her shoulders, unsure of what else to do to convey the idea that she would believe it when she saw it. "You know," said Sig in a suddenly solemn tone, "we would have all died if it weren't for you, Stephanie Mason. We are lucky to have you with us." Stephanie smiled and mouthed, "Thank you," as she signed the expression to Sig. Sig smiled warmly. "So, any ideas of what we should expect when we get to the temperate zone?" asked Sig, hoping to lighten the subject. Stephanie had not been the one being sucked into visions of the future, and she welcomed the reprieve, however brief it might be. She shook her head. Sig nodded. "I suppose it's just as well," said Sig. "I like being surprised." He turned to look out to the horizon. Stephanie pulled her arms close to warm her body from the cold wind. The stars shined in the sky as the moons reflected onto the choppy water below. In spite of the catastrophe that was beginning to kill everything in the hot and cold zones, there was almost a warm familiarity that came from seeing the moon in pieces. Though they had gone 500 years into the past, the world no longer seemed as foreign as it had when they had first stepped out of the cavern in the Rocky Mountains and seen it. The moment of calm was suddenly interrupted by Lizard appearing on the deck. He laughed hysterically as he turned to the cabin. Sig laughed with him, although he had no idea what was so funny. Lizard breathed deeply to regain his composure before approaching the cabin door. Stephanie and Sig gave each other looks of confusion as Lizard turned the knob and snuck in. Inside the cabin, Row 82 and Lucas were attempting to get some rest. Victor was sitting next to Jennifer, and Jonathan was snuggled up next to Kirana. Lizard covered his mouth to avoid bursting out laughing. He reached into a pocket on his coat and retrieved a phone. He tapped the screen several times to get to a music playing application. He tapped a folder called Disney Classic Music and began playing a song. Slowly he adjusted the volume as the music started. It was difficult for them to understand the words being sung by the low voice for the first couple of measures, but everyone heard the lyrics, "Go on and kiss the girl." Victor and Jonathan both turned bright red, and Lizard burst out laughing. Lucas snickered a bit as the song continued. Even Row 82 smiled a bit as Lizard began trying to sing along. Of course, not knowing the lyrics well, he mostly mumbled except for the sha-la-la-la-la and kiss the girl. "Very funny," muttered Victor. Lizard burst out laughing again. Lucas giggled a bit. Jonathan turned away from Kirana in embarrassment, but Kirana did not move. "Oh, come on, Jonathan," said Lizard. "Don't be like that. Go on and kiss the girl." He laughed again. "Don't wake her up," said Jonathan. All right, said Lizard as he stopped the music. He laughed softly for a bit longer. "You guys are jerks," muttered Jonathan as he walked outside. He saw Stephanie with her long dark hair tossing about in the wind and imagined how awkward the situation would be. He froze outside the cabin door for a few moments, not wanting to go back inside and not wanting to cause issues with Stephanie. She turned back and saw him standing in his long white cloak, and then turned away, also hoping to avoid awkwardness. "Hey, Jonathan," said Sig cheerfully. "Hello," he said at last as he approached them. "Everything all right?" asked Sig. "Yeah, it's fine," said Jonathan as he looked out into the starry night and took a deep breath. He turned and looked out at the horizon. The choppy water seemed to go in all directions. The ship swayed as it pressed north. "How much longer before we reach land?" asked Jonathan at last. Sig laughed. "I don't think it will be much longer," he replied. "I thought you were enjoying the time here." "I was," he said, "but being cramped up in this boat for too long is probably not good for any of us." "I suppose that's right," said Sig with a smile. "Even Lizard, who was able to go anywhere, seems to be wearying of being here." "Yeah," said Jonathan in agreement. "You should come out here more often," said Sig. He took a deep breath. "It's refreshing." Jonathan did have to admit that it was helpful to have fresh air for a bit, even though it was colder than he liked. It was certainly warmer than trudging through the snow in Antarctica. As the wind tossed his hair about and made his cloak flap behind him, he did feel better. Stephanie tried to avoid looking at Jonathan. The sight of his cloak flapping behind him caught her attention, though, and she turned toward him. It was as though time slowed down. He looked toward her slowly. She wanted to look away, but felt immobilized. Suddenly she realized the reason was that she had been caught up in a vision. "Angelica Sterling!" exclaimed Jonathan in her vision. She felt awkward and confused. Suddenly Jonathan began glowing brightly. "She is going to take Jennifer." "What is this?" asked Stephanie. The glowing turned to flames. Jonathan was on fire. He screamed in agony. Light swirled around everywhere, making Stephanie feel nauseated and dizzy. She closed her eyes. "Stephanie?" called Sig. Stephanie opened her eyes, free from her vision. Sig helped her as she slowly got to her feet. "Are you all right?" asked Sig. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. In the distance, a bright orange light caught her attention. She tilted her head and narrowed her eyes as she noticed it growing larger. Suddenly she realized what it was. She grabbed Jonathan and threw him out of the way. "Stephanie?" shouted Jonathan as he got to his feet. She rushed toward Sig and tried to push him back. Suddenly the light caught their attention as well. "What is that?" whispered Sig. "I don't know," said Jonathan in a low voice as it grew larger. Suddenly Sig's eyes grew wide. He reached for his key, but was not quick enough. The orange light was the fiery attack of a demon worshipper, and it ripped through the boat, piercing it. The small craft spun around as water rose through the gaping hole. Jonathan realized it had hit the spot where he had been standing, and that Stephanie had saved him. He looked at her with wide eyes. She looked at him awkwardly for a moment. "Thank you," said Jonathan. She pointed to the cabin as another fireball struck the motor. Jonathan leapt into the door to get everyone free. Though they had hoped to arrive in the temperate zone by boat, it was clear that their sinking ship would not be able to help them, and if they did not act very quickly, it would take them down into the freezing water.